And now we'll play the video, and then we'll have Q&A after. Someone cut the lights for me, please.
All right, so my name is Tayte Adderley. I'm currently a PhD student in public policy at Northeastern University. And today my presentation will look at counting and its implications for Bahamian democracy. So starting to understand what this idea of counting, or what I mean by the term counting, I'm specifically referring to, a state or a government being able to collect information about a variety of phenomena. So looking at population data, inequality and poverty, climate data, governance data, and many other things that relate to, what's happening in the territory that it governs. And I think we can also talk about the idea of being able to access information. And so the right of people to obtain information held by public authorities with freedom of information laws, and citizens being able to request and receive government records, unless they fall on certain exemptions. And this is all done to basically promote transparency and accountability in government. And kind of looking at the state of information, or the state of counting in the Bahamas today, I'm mainly looking at the Bahamas National Statistical Institute, which is the body responsible for reproducing or producing statistics in the Bahamas, and kind of just trying to interact and understanding what's happening at the BSB and SI. We know that the challenges are with limited economic statistics and labor market data, and sometimes always often inconsistent poverty metrics. And one example of this is this idea of what we call the poverty line, right? I think looking at when the last household expenditure survey was done, the last thing that we understood what the poverty line was in the Bahamas, I think it was 2013. And kind of looking at other reports before that, it seemed like the last living conditions survey before the 2013 report was done in 2001. But outside of the BNSI, we also have other government bodies that do collect data about various things. So like the Ministry of Education and the Central Bank of Bahamas. The Central Bank of Bahamas is mainly responsible for economic statistics, trade statistics, and understanding where the state of GDP is of the country, stuff like that. But the issue is that some of these bodies collect information, yet they don't regularly make that data available and accessible to the public. And so when I talk about, the data that we do have or do understand, the problem is that it is often not disaggregated by different districts. So how in the Bahamas, you might live in Yamacraw, or you might live in, let's say, West Grand Bahama. That information, although we have some idea of the overall outlook for the country, the problem is that when we have the information, the issue is that we don't know what it is, or how, let's say, how Yamacraw might contribute to GDP, or like another place like Kalani might contribute to the GDP. That information often isn't always as disaggregated as it needs to be. And then sometimes when it comes to statistical information, we do have these general statements made by agencies or ministries like the Ministry of Education, right? How they may talk about the BGCSE exam results, but often when it comes to actually sharing that information, the public usually doesn't have access to that, particular document or the actual full report of what's happening when it comes to BGCSE examinations and other issues in the country. And then we can also talk about the freedom of information regime in the Bahamas. So we do know that when it comes to FOIA, FOIA I think was passed in 2017 or around there, and supposed to be I think fully implemented in 2019. But we do know that that full implementation of the act is still pending. And when it comes to freedom of information implementation, kind of looking at this particular administration who has openly said that it's a priority for their administration, but also kind of looking at the lackluster support basically for the 4-Year Act and its implementation as well. Successive administrations basically have not made the concerted effort towards really implementing freedom of information in the Bahamas. And so when we look at the budget allocations for like places like freedom of information as well as the Office of the Information Commissioner, the budget allocations that have been made for those offices are usually not enough. So looking at the budget allocation, I think for the last 2 budget cycles, it's been stuck at 140,000, which in a sense, I guess, does point to how it's not a priority for this particular administration. And also the fact that when it comes to the Office of the Information Commissioner, it still lacks full technical support as well as staff to really implement what it needs to do. And so kind of understanding that, we've seen that I think for some time now they've been trying to really do a good job at pulling off a pilot program in terms of how the information access regime would work. But that's been pending, I think, since 2022, 2021, and we haven't seen much updated information about that particular initiative from the Information Commissioner. So kind of understanding why poor capacity exists when it comes to our informational infrastructure as well as data infrastructure. I think we can point to a number of reasons, kind of understanding that there are not personnel capable of doing like really hard and really considered statistical work. Then there's also the concern of there being like the political influence and the lack of political will, the underfunding and institutional weakness, and then I think there is a dependence on external assistance when it comes to gathering data. And kind of looking at the fruit of that when it comes to this indicator known as the Open Data Inventory Score, the Bahamas ranks 177th out of 198. And the Open Data Inventory Score kind of looks at coverage and openness. And so the Bahamas scores on 37 out of 100 on the coverage score, and 32 out of 100 on the openness score. And when it comes to social, economic, and environmental statistics, we score low on the social statistics based on also looking at coverage, meaning that what topics they cover and the statistics that we do have about social statistics. Then we also talk about 35 out of 100 when it comes to the openness, being how available that information is. So we'll score on that when it comes to social statistics, it's 30 out of 100. So we seemingly do well when it comes to economic statistics, with a 69 out of 100 score for coverage and a 39 out of 100 score for openness. Overall giving us a 52, sorry, it's a typo, out of 100 score rather, sorry. And also looking at environment, also low on environment, lower than what we have on social statistics. So kind of understanding the data regime or the information regime that we have in the Bahamas, we score very low when it comes to access information for the public, but also on what we cover and what we can provide to the public when it comes to that type of data, or these type of data, sorry. And understanding all of this, the argument that I'm making here, looking at certain case studies or certain stories that have happened in Bahamian history as of recent and in the past, sorry, discussions about the information regime in the Bahamas and the wider Caribbean highlight this issue as mainly a technical problem. But I do think that the lack of statistical data has more than technical implications. I think poor data capacity can erode democracy itself. It also erodes how we govern the country and what the government can do when it comes to tackling policy and implementing policy. I'm also trying to figure out how to solve social problems, or when trying to face natural disasters, stuff like that. And building upon this and basically, I'm using concepts from Foucault, who talks about or focuses on like knowledge is power, control of information constitutes political power, governmentality, how modern states govern through the knowledge of the populations that exist within their borders. Also, this idea of biopower, how statistical knowledge enables population management and counting, and basically looking at what gets counted reveals power structures. And so I first want to talk about the idea of what counts, what we count, and how what we count can be used to misrepresent reality, right? So what is regularly counted and collected usually reveals an administration's priorities and concerns. And what is collected can be conveniently used to distort and misrepresent reality. So one of the things that we seem to do a very good job at counting is tourism statistics. And we do a very good job seemingly at collecting that information. And as we know, tourism is everybody's business. And I think how the tourism statistics has been used, particularly in this administration, kind of paints the country as making some sort of economic progress, right? However, when we kind of look and dig deeper into the tourism statistics and understanding the composition of the tourism market, it's clear that this is some sort of, or that this is actually a misrepresentation of what is actually happening within the economy. And so I think in 2023, there was the statistic that we hit about 9 million tourists, or 9.2 million tourists as our record-breaking year. And then this year, we were able to now break that record again with 11.2 million visitors last year in 2024. However, like I mentioned, when you look at these statistics and when you kind of understand the composition of this, it becomes clear that these numbers should be looked at with scrutiny, right? So looking at the statistics that was provided for us for the 2024 year, 11.2 million tourist visitors in 2024. And of that number, nearly 84% was cruise visitors, and nearly 16%, or 16.6% rather, were stopover tourists. And so that tells you that majority of the visitors that come to the Bahamas are cruise visitors. And really understanding specifically cruises, right? Of the cruise visitors that come to the Bahamas, majority of them probably never leave the boat, as cruises are designed as what we call like total institutions, right? And so when it comes to this idea of a total institution, the cruise is in a way designed as a mechanism to keep you on the boat, basically, to provide you with all the amenities that you need with no reason ever to leave the boat, right? And so basically, if you understand that, what is the guarantee if somebody who's a cruiser and they spend most of their time, or they spend their time on the cruise ship, and the cruise ship has all the amenities that they need, then what is the incentive for them to come off the boat and actually visit a place like Bay Street, or go to what are the offerings that Nassau or the Providence or other places in the Bahamas may have? And so when you understand that, it begins to like really paint about that picture of what people try to paint as some sort of economic progress when it comes to these tourism numbers. And also kind of looking at the spending, right? Cruise passengers spend much less than when it comes to stopover visitors. And one example of this is looking at the information or the numbers that we get from the Central Bank of the Bahamas. Looking at this figure here, when it comes to cruise visitors and stopover visitors in millions, comparing that to, let's say, the recent one that we have, I think the most recent one, according to the Central Bank of the Bahamas statistics, was about from 2017. And looking at that, we see that stopover tourists spent at least roughly $2.6 billion compared to what cruise visitors spend in terms of money being $300 million or so, right? And so kind of understanding this picture and really taking the time to really dig into what information is out there on the tourism numbers, what is purported to be some sort of economic progress or some sort of growth for the economy, kind of picking apart these numbers, you can see that the statements being made or what is being implied rather in these statements or public statements is sort of questionable. It can be questioned rather. And so I think using the way that we use tourism numbers and the way that we talk about these records purport that there is great growth happening. But when you look at these numbers, then that picture that's being painted becomes really questionable. And so coming out of the tourism accounting thing, I also want to talk about how data gaps and knowledge gaps can feed into fear. And so the absence of official data is never politically neutral. It creates a space for alternative narratives and allows for others with the means and will to define reality. It's especially being able to control the narrative. And in cases where there are no official statistics, competing groups can advance unverifiable claims and feed into public hysteria. And in this case, in talking about this case and understanding Foucault's framework, I want to talk a little bit about what happened in 2022 when the Haitian Charge d'Affaires, Anthony Pierre Burtis, claimed that there were 150,000 Haitians nationals living in the Bahamas. And so kind of if these claims that Brutus had made were true, then that would mean that, Haitian nationals accounted for nearly 40% of the Bahamian population. And in response to this, I can remember reading the Facebook comments and the comments made on some of the news websites of the dailies in Nassau. The public really responded with vitriol, kind of without questioning whether these claims were accurate. And I think in the eyes of the public, this claim can legitimize this idea of a Haitian invasion, that Haitians are everywhere, and that that they have this secretive concerted effort to in some way take control of the Bahamas and drown out the organic Bahamian population. And so this is one example of how not knowing or having knowledge gaps and not having data statistics about who was counted within the population or who was living within our borders can really affect the democratic process. So I'll talk a little bit about this some more. So when it came to this particular issue of the statements made by Brutus, I do think that the response that was made by the government at the time, for the 2022, was not enough. And so Keith Bell, the then Minister of Immigration, called the claims erroneous, but he didn't essentially provide any official numbers to counter the statements that Brutus had made. And so essentially saying that he did not agree with him, saying that he knew that isn't the case, but then also saying that we have to review, the numbers, suggesting that, making me question rather whether they actually at the time had the information and the data to actually counter what was being said by the Haitian Charge d'Affaires. So he says, we have to do more in-depth scientific analysis to ensure that we get the right numbers. And when we talk about documented migrants, again, there are so many categories that you have to look at as a country we have to review, right? And so while the government responded to those claims, the response did not, I think, do a good job at quelling those fears that those fairs that were happening among the Bahamian populace. And I think that if we had the proper data, if we collected the proper information, if we had the actual apparatuses within the Ministry of Immigration to really count, not necessarily the ability to count rather, but also that if we regularly posted and gave the public the information about who's here in terms of immigration, or who comes here for immigration, or who visits the country for some type of purpose, I do think that they could do a better job at kind of quelling those fears that were happening at the time when this comment was made by Brutus. And this is especially at a time, I think, when those comments were made, there was a sort of rising populism, I think, within the Bahamian psyche. And so we often talk about Leaking Bahame and the Coalition of Independence, right? I do think around that time, during the 2021 general election, we saw the rise of Leaking Bahame and his Coalition of Independence, and they did a very good job at kind of playing on that the angst within the Bahamian population about the Haitian population existing here, and that there being some sort of Haitian invasion, and that also, in some way I don't want to say defining the term, I would say rather probably popularizing the term an organic Bahamian. And so these comments were made when populist politics, in a sense, were on the rise during that 2021-2022 period. And so we know that the Coalition of Independence has taken to really marking and attempting to bulldoze homes and shantytowns in response to government inaction on the shantytown issue. But also I want to say that the COI is not guilty of this alone, and I think successive administrations and other political agitators have blamed Haitians for the country's economic and infrastructure and social woes. And so kind of how that situation was dealt with, I think, in a sense, fed into this narrative that's been kind of like brewing for a very long time in the Bahamas about Haitians Haitians taking over the Bahamas, right? And I think we need to do a better job at kind of trying to quell those fears, right? Within the populace, to show them that this invasion that you're speaking of is not real. I don't think it's real. And also, I don't have a problem with Haitians either. So I think that we should do a better job with official data at trying to kind of quell the sort of angst that the Bahamians feel about the Haitian population within the Bahamas. They're here, they exist. We have an historic connection to Haiti and Haitians as well. And I think we need to do a better job at kind of quelling those fears that the Bahamians have. And it'll become more especially important as I think that the economic woes that we're experiencing as a country continue. And I do believe that there's some connection between worsening economic prospects amongst the population and the agitation towards Haitians as some reason to blame them for what's happening in the country. So that's one example. Another example of how the data gaps can really affect democracy and make people feel as though that there is some invasion taking over, and this being used as a way for certain groups to rise to power and use Haitians as scapegoats in pursuit of power. Then there's this aspect of governmentality. And within this theme, I want to really ask whether the population, or the government rather, the state itself, does it care about the population that it governs, right? And so Foucault argued that modern states emerge through new forms of knowledge about the populations that they govern. And the capacity to govern depends on fundamentally knowing the population through counting, measuring, and categorizing. And without knowing, a population can become unseen. And so kind of flipping that, Foucault says basically that the population becomes seen through this knowledge apparatus, and I'm saying without it, the population can become unseen if it doesn't exist. And with that, I think we can ask also fundamentally, does the Bahamian state care about the population that exists within its borders? And so in the Bahamian context, without comprehensive demographic data, the state cannot effectively target social programs. Economic planning becomes guesswork rather than strategic intervention. Resource allocation lacks a political foundation, and policy evaluation basically becomes guesswork, or it becomes hard to do because you don't have the actual data to really understand whether the policies you've implemented are having some sort of effect among the population. And one example of this I think we can look at really is Hurricane Dorian, specifically understanding how many people died during Hurricane Dorian, right? And so kind of questioning who were among the dead. And there were claims or reports that different agencies had different figures when it came to the missing and the dead. Also the fact that undocumented migrants were not counted among the dead when it came to certain starts at the time. And so to this day, I question whether do we actually have an official count of people who were actually affected or who actually died during the storm. Also, the list of people that were missing as a result of Hurricane Dorian. Then there's this aspect of like disaster recovery and disaster resilience and how to basically ensure that your recovery efforts are effective, right? And so maps are an important aspect in tackling disasters. And so when it came to geospatial data, the data was not accessible at the time of Hurricane Dorian, even if it existed. And looking at different reports and different statements that were made toward the press and within official reports by different agencies that came to the Bahamas, it was apparent that information was not shared between state agencies. So there were like basically walls between agencies when it came to different data and access to it, right? And so one example of this being was that I think a humanitarian group, I think Humanitarian Open Street Maps or something like that, had to come to the Bahamas or had to help the Bahamas when it came to really tackling Hurricane Dorian, especially when it came to Abaco, because the maps of islands such as Abaco were incomplete. And so basically, when it comes to mapping, and that's not collecting the information, not geospatial information, it definitely affected how we responded to Hurricane Dorian, and it affected our capacity to really respond to what was happening on the ground. And kind of understanding what happened with Hurricane Dorian, I think we can question whether does the state itself, the Bahamian state, truly understand the impact that Hurricane Dorian had? Do we understand how many people were displaced? Are the data apparatuses in place to prepare us for the next hurricane that happens of that magnitude? How did the hurricane affect different population segments within Grand Bahama and Abaco? How was other islands affected as a result of what happened in Grand Bahama and Abaco? What was the long-term impacts on our ecosystems, right? And so kind of understanding the ability to collect information and its effect on policy apparatus, and it's also its effect on governmentality. Thinking about Hurricane Dorian, think about national crises, and thinking about natural disasters, we have to really question whether we have the capacity to govern the population. Do we see the population? And if the population is unseen, then it becomes hard to respond to problems. And problems also sometimes become invisible because we don't have the data to confirm those problems. And the last part that I want to talk about is this idea of like looking at geographic boundaries. And I kind of made this observation when I was taking a GIS class for my master's degree, and I wanted to kind of look at the population of New Providence and delimited, subset by different boundaries within New Providence itself. And so I created this map originally, kind of looking at the electoral boundaries that were from the 2021 general election, but also we're using 2017 general election. And I think the question that I originally had was, why is Kalani so big? And looking at the 2012 boundaries that we use in the 2012 general election, we can see that Kalani basically gobbles up Clifton, and Golden Isles also gobbles up a part of Clifton as well. And when we look at that and when we put these two boundaries on top of each other, comparing 2012 to 2017, the question becomes, between those 5 years, what negated the changes between the electoral boundaries when it came to these geographic boundaries for the islands and province? But also, this question can be asked probably for the islands of the Bahamas as well. So looking at this map, the blue is 2012, the red is the boundaries from 2017 to 2021. We can see here, as I stated, that Kalani basically gobbles up Clifton, as well as Golden Isles, kind of gobbling a part of Clifton. Then we also have St. Anne's in this area, kind of extending out into, I think, what is now Freetown, or what was once Montague. I think kind of looking at these boundaries, kind of questioning, what is the reasoning behind these changes 5 years in between two general elections, right? And so why I ask this question is because geographic boundaries are very important when it comes to policy and governance, as well as democracy. And so we know that, the issue of gerrymandering is often talked about in the Bahamas, but what's often talked about is not often raised towards administrations of current times. So so in the history class, we'd always talk about how the UPP, was guilty of gerrymandering the elections that the PLP was in, which caused them to lose elections, right? But we don't question, I think, we don't talk about enough question whether the current administrations that, we have, and the political parties that we have, whether they gerrymander these electoral boundaries. And I think it seems as though there is some implication that it does happen sometimes. But I believe that when it comes to these boundaries, they should be mostly consistent. And these changes to boundaries usually occur every 10 to 15 years. And when it comes to the census, the Bahamas uses the electoral boundaries from the census to count certain populations within certain areas. Okay? And so how these boundaries are drawn, how these boundaries come about, they have governance and policy implications, like I said. It becomes, how do we track policy issues? When it comes to population counts, demographic changes, economic indicators, they all become meaningless if you can't compare the same geographic area over the same time. Then there's also the question of, how do we tackle and pursue evidence-based policy? You might think that we might notice that housing is affordable in this particular area, like let's say, what if housing in Yamarua is more affordable than housing in Killarney? And you can question, what are the factors driving this outcome? But we can't do that if the geographic boundaries are always changing based on the constituency boundaries that we have in the Bahamas. And then also we have the fact that people also define themselves within the boundaries that they live within. And so understanding all of that, I think we can question what is driving the decisions that change the constituency boundaries, and is that knowledge public, right? And kind of understanding how we do statistics in the Bahamas, how we collect information, how we disseminate information in the Bahamas. I think I'd like to make some concluding thoughts on this issue, right? I think that a state that collects information on the population within its borders demonstrates in some fundamental way that it cares about the population that it governs. And the gaps in our statistical capacity or infrastructure, are not merely technical problems. They represent a deeper question about the kind of democracy we want to build. And the main challenges are dealing with visibility, where entire populations like undocumented migrants after Hurricane Dorian can disappear from official concern simply because they were never counted or they were never given the proper care that they should have been given in count statistics. Then there's the question of accountability, where tourism numbers can be used to mask economic realities. Then there's a crisis of governance, where the state cannot see its own territory clear enough to respond to disasters effectively, plan infrastructure, or target social programs based on the geographical boundaries that we change every year, or change every few years, without understanding, what are the drivers of these changes. And so ultimately understanding all of this, I think that we should ask for and demand for the full implementation of freedom of information laws. I think that we should demand for regular comprehensive census and information gathering cycles and open data initiatives that make government information truly public for people to access, to digest, and to really make decisions electorally based on those decisions. So, yeah, that is the end of my presentation, and thank you for paying attention.
Okay, Tate, we'll open up for questions.
All right, can you hear me?
Can you raise your volume? I'll try to do the same on this end. And hope for the best. I think I have to just change where the audio is going. Can you hear us? Speak again, please, Tate.
Can you hear me now?
Let's change it on the Zoom settings. Okay.
Yeah, we'll work it out. If I have to, I'll put the mic nearby if that's what we have to do. But go ahead.
Okay.
Now repeat the question if I have to. Speak to the mic. Speak to the mic. Is it on? Press.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I love the presentation because I happen to love statistics and I had to use them as a writer. I just wanted to bring some historical context because my memory goes quite far back. My mother was a journalist and she remembers when it was then the statistics department, when it first started under the Pindling administration. And we had no computers at that time. But what is actually interesting is that under the Pindling administration, and we still have these copies, they regularly published copious statistics on every aspect of this society. We had no computers at that time, and you could call up any ministry, you could get any information that you want. But what is interesting is, as time has gone on, statistics now are treated as a state secret. Mm-hmm. And more, I mean, for 20 years I was writing a business and economics column, and over that time I could find more and more, you could find fewer statistics, the various ministries, you would need like applications to get the numbers. In fact, I had an experience of calling up last year the road traffic department. They have the figures for how many cars there are on the roads. They know what type of vehicles, whether they're electric, whether they're gas. They would not give me these statistics because I was just a member of the general public. That's just not available to the public. What are we hiding this for? This is exactly what you were saying. This is so critical to our democracy. We cannot govern. We're governing by emotion rather than through any realism, I guess, reality. It's only what we're feeling about the situation. We have nothing that we can turn to. And I think this is really having a tremendous impact on our democracy. But anyway, I'm glad that you brought up the whole issue of counting because it is extremely important.
You want to respond, Tate?
Yeah, if she can hear me, I want to say thank you for
course.
that.
Go on.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that historical context. I sometimes like when I used to work at my old office, I would see like reports on like education statistics in the old office I used to work at in the Organization for Responsible Governance. And I would see reports from like the 1970s, 1980s, and I was shocked that there was some record of like this information existing about certain issues. And now that you're saying basically that we got a copious amount of statistics back then, even when they didn't have computers, I think it's quite a shame, especially now that when it comes to the technology that we have now and how we can, really manage populations digitally, I think this reflects quite poorly on how we govern in the Bahamas. And I also want to say thank you for um, referring to it as the state secret. That's like my conspiracy, I guess I would say. But I've never had the information to confirm it, so I'm very thankful for you saying that. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And I just find it surprising, because we look back at the Finley administration and we think, oh, everything was just so secretive then. But ironically, not when it came to statistics. But yet now, when you think everything is more open and there's more freedom, actually, there's less available to us. So anyway,
Yes.
just a thought.
Thank you, Mr. Adderley. That was very provocative. It reminded me of my studies of Foucault as well. In particular, his understanding of the relationship between knowledge and power. And I want to sort of say what I want to say within that context. So I take issue with the fact that you seem to be presenting the idea that all counting is benign. And all counting is not benign. There's some counting that it actually is, the basis of it is malevolence. And I want to sort of make that point in relation to that part of your presentation relating to Haitian Bahamians. And I'll just use a little sort of anecdote to sort of prep what I want to say about that. I had some colleagues thinking about doing a research project around identifying where Haitian Bahamians lived in the Bahamas. And that was problematic because obviously you could see how that could be used for malicious purposes, right? So when it comes to counting Haitian Bahamians and making that an official count, I'm not certain we're serving the Haitian Bahamian population by doing that. And in fact, I would go further to say that the Haitian charge d'affaires, right, leaving it just like that, based on his understanding, is a safer position for Haitian Bahamians in the country. So I'd like to hear your perspective on that perspective. Thanks.
So I agree with you. The perspective that I'm taking is that I'm mainly taking it from someone who is a PhD student in public policy, and I think why I'm so passionate about this is the fact that I want my work to be based on the Bahamas. I want to understand policy issues in the Bahamas, right? And I think sometimes that enthusiasm about data itself and understanding, what is happening within the Bahamian population can present things in a very benign way. But I do agree that all counting is not benign, and I do think that having access to like that particular example that you bring up with Haitian Bahamians, I think that's an example of how counting can go wrong, and it can be used as an apparatus to basically try to deport people and bulldoze homes and remove people from the Bahamas. So I agree with you. I agree with that take, yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I just want to say a couple things. I can go on the Bahamas government website now, and I can get quite a bit of, well, it mightn't be last year information, but the information would be 2 or 3 years back, all right, because they have them by government offices and stuff, and you can find it. Education does a survey every year that is usually maybe 2 years behind in publication. You can also get, I can't say the last year they produced a book of education statistics in terms of the number of schools, the number of students, etc. But that is relatively, well, I guess when you say relatively new, not outdated, I would think, I haven't looked at it in a while, but the last time I looked, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago. So it isn't that it all goes back to, years back. Tourism data, like you indicated, is always there, and we all agree that stopover visitors spend far more than cruise ship visitors, and that's why they're trying, other social things like restructuring Bay Street, bringing back the old Bahamian flavors and music, etc., to encourage people to come for a stopover, rather than just on the cruise ship. And as far as the data I know, most of the cruise ship visitors do not stay on ship. Now, the second and third time visitors, they do not come off the ship, but first time visitors, most of them do, in terms of statistics I've got, most of them do come off. I also wanted to say, in terms of counting the population, there's a lot of factors happening there. One of the major factors is us right here in this room, the Bahamian population themselves, and whatever our attitude is, or whatever, misgivings we have. We're finding that the response rate from the population is far, far lower than it has ever been. When I started in in statistics, labor force surveys and censuses used to have the highest response rate in the Caribbean, 94% response rate, and those data was published within a year or two after collecting them. Nowadays, you go out there, and it's happening throughout the region. Several of the countries in the region could not even produce their census data because the undercount or the was too low, the cooperation. For us, we had a cooperation of response rate of maybe, I can't remember, 60-something percent initially, and they went back out several times. Barbados and Trinidad didn't even do one. And it's also what's happening within the society, the crime, the political unrest, whatever it is. But we as people, and I heard several persons in here talking about how we're the people who have to do it. We have to push. So part of that pushing is on our part too. When the census people, especially household surveys, people come to your door, you don't shoo them away and say, I am not a part of it, and that's what's happening in the Bahamas. Throughout, it's happening. People don't want to be a part of it, yet these same people want the information. All right? I can give you an example without calling name. This big businessman wanted to know what areas he can establish certain businesses. When I saw his name on the list of non-response, I called him, and he said, but that doesn't affect me, that don't, and they don't realize that it is us who give the information, who will then, we as people give the information, and then the analysts or the technocrats will compile it and produce it. So, that is one thing we have to do, and some of these professors from the college know the same thing, because we have worked together on certain surveys. The expenditure survey that gives the poverty index and line is just completing now. It's been out in the field for a couple of months. is about to be completed. The schedule, whatever deadline for producing the figures is middle of next year. However, the response rate is so low. I think people don't realize what goes into getting the data. Because we don't have income tax and that sort of thing, you have to go door to door, because in order to know how people are living and how to get a poverty line, etc., you have to ask the whole umbrella of information. The interview, don't care how you try to sort it out, takes at least 2 hours. And people, we would tell them, we can do it in 2 sessions or whatever. You also have to keep a booklet that records everything you spend within a certain period, whether it's a week or 2 weeks. I'm keeping no booklet, you know what that is? And so that is the kind of thing you're faced with. Now, some countries have given up on that sort of thing, and they do it from an income approach. And they can go to their income tax records, and they can, they have other records. We're a new nation in terms of collecting data. So we don't have all that sources of information there to be able to, use that to produce things like how you're living. Because we have to know how people, where they're living, how they're living, their health, their total health. We have to measure them, their weight, and see how tall they are, and ask about their diet and what they eat. And health combines with us on that, because health are the ones who do the measuring of the thing. So what I'm saying is not just an easy thing. Education, you have to find it out for every person in the household. It's just a very, very, I know about 20 years ago or so, or 15 years ago, I myself had to go in the field and collect that kind of data, and it was, so, we say that, plus it's a matter of cost.
Now, I know you know statistics, that's your life, but we do have to let a couple of
Okay, yes, so I'm just saying, plus it's a matter of cost, okay?
Yes.
I just want you to realize, to listen, that, and the people here, to realize it's not, that easy. We're doing and we're trying to improve. One last thing, in terms of the GIS, etc., it's quite what's ingrained here now. And so what the police and the Department of Statistics, etc., what they're doing, they are putting grids on the chart. So if you come in here and you want to know Kalani 20 years ago, because of the grids gives all the description. We can then map it out in a grid and say, well, this is Kalani 10 years ago, and this is it now. So you can do that comparison. And there's more to share, but let me sit
These are the final 2.
Just building off of Michael. Yeah, so we're in a world right now where all the data that's out there in the world is being used by the tech industry. They're being weaponized against human creativity and the human mind. And, to me, it's become a somewhat refreshing thing, a benefit of living and working in the Bahamas, in that we don't have reliable data out there. In that, when I get the AI garbage I get from my students is obviously AI garbage. So I can point them out when they're like, example from over the summer, I don't know if it's still true, but if you asked over the summer what percentage of Bahamians have a PhD, Google's AI would tell you that's 19%. And so, anyway, I just wanted to put that out there as like an extension of this. Not all accounting or not all data is benevolent.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Hey, Dave. So I thought it was interesting that you pointed out, well, obviously I think me and you agree on some issues, but I got to come back to you, Fran. So I wanted to, I have 2 instances that corroborate, I guess, what you found in your own studies. One of the things that I often point out is the exclusion of data points about LGBTQ plus people, right? And I called, and I called Kim Sanders. I call her names, right? Because, and I had a long conversation with her. This was around the time that Marlon was there. We got to a point where she was like, you know, the Constitution doesn't, whatever. And I was like, but you could still count us as single people though. And she was like, she went blank on the phone because that didn't compute to her. That she was like, well, y'all can't get married. I was like, what does that have to do with us counting us, right? And her thing was it's not a point of like policy or interest of the government. She said this without saying this per se, right? I had to read between the lines because, you know, when you're talking to government workers, they give you there's only so much I could do spiel, right? And we know that it's not them, right? So she referred me to Marlon. I spoke with Marlon. I asked her about getting an LGBT plus person on the board, or she was telling me about the process. It's every 10 years. Y'all start and y'all gather a group of people around. And I was like, well, then y'all should at least call me, Erin, Alicia, Helen, somebody, you know, to be on the board, right? To be a part of the process. And she was like, yeah, I'll think about it. So that's something that's not happening. That's, you know, counting. And I think that's important, right? I mean, to Dr. Armbring's point, yeah, but I mean, the data, especially when we're looking for funding, in particular for marginalized groups, we're trying to ensure that certain services happen and we're put at risk. That's important, for at least for this data point or this data entry, right, or this group of people. And then recently, when I was trying to find out statistics about the 2022 census, I called again. And this time she wouldn't answer me, right? She refused to come to the phone this time, right? But I sent her an email, never got a response. And I was asking her, why is race? Because you know in the initial statistics, y'all gave some of the more important thing up. And I wanted to find out why was race visibly missing from the preliminary statistics. And race is one of, you know, the important ones. I think you had age and all of the other ones, but race was visibly absent from the preliminary statistics. And I was trying to compare the racial statistics now to the last one, which is 2010, right? And I can't do that because they don't like, you know, especially in government offices, they don't like when I call them.
Thank you.
Huh? I can't remember, but I was trying to do was compare to see how the racial makeup has changed over the years. Because like I told you before, I think that we are in a lot of cases undercounting, and as Tayte was talking about, I think at least from an exclusionary point of view, if you're marginalized, you can see the flaws of the counting because the government is only counting what it feels it can show off at the end of the day and say, hey, look at us, look at what we done. That's what tourism is about.
Okay, thank you. We've got to. That conversation could be very lively outside the hall. Let's give it final sentence, Tate. Final sentence.
I just want to say one thing. I think the team makes a great point. There was this, and speaking specifically about queer rights, right? There was this statistic, I think this certain report that was important to the whole gay rights movement in the United States, where it gave a certain number of suggesting or estimating that a certain percentage of the homosexual population or the gay population in the United States was a certain percentage, right? And that particular statistic was important because it made people realize that their particular group, the queer people who were queer, that group of people basically were bigger than they thought they were, right? And that certain statistical point basically kind of made that movement, or it made those people feel seen, right? And so I think Latino's making a great point, because if you don't count these people, and if you don't make the initiative of counting these things, then that has implications for people, how people feel about themselves, how they view themselves, and how they see themselves within the certain nation that they live within. So that's the point I want to make to the Latino's comment.
That's very
That's the point I want to make, sorry.
All right, thanks again so much for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
All right, so, boy, y'all, it's something else. Melanie is here, tall. You know, okay, so